What's up, guys? This is Fedor, and today I'm hitting you with a hand history review of a bluff I did in the 10K Super Millions against Alex Ponakov's, and it was a pretty aggressive play. And I want to share some thoughts of like how I construct or deconstruct a hand like that. I think it's interesting to dive into one of the biggest buy-ins. I made the final table, so this is exciting. But let's take a look at this hand that I played. We are in the big blind with Queen Jack off, and Alex opens from the high Jack with the chip lead on the table, or basically sharing the chip lead with Viktor Malinovsky. And I am in the big blind with 34 big blinds, and I have Queen Jack off. I opt to defend and just call my Queen Jack off. And now we are in an interesting spot. So it's 10-3 deuce with 10-3 of hearts. Maybe to share my thoughts first on this flop. Generally, I think I'm obviously, given that payouts are in play and we are approaching the final table, there's 15 players left, I'm fourth playing against the chip leader. I will definitely want to play less call-y, a bit more cautious, so folding a bit more. And I think the shift will be that he plays a bit more aggressive. We want to put a bit more chips into the pot, putting more pressure on me, and I want to be reasonable, adapt to that, and not play too aggressive, but stand my ground in a certain way. And there are some exploits in these type of dynamics that I think you can find. And so on this board structure, generally I would say that there is a mix between calling and raising that we want to do, and there is a reasonable amount of hands that we want to raise here. So I would say in terms of value, King 10 and Ace 10 are very clear value raises, and majority of Queen 10, and then I'm going to mix in some other 10s as well. And obviously we want to have some bluffs as well. If we think about the best possible bluff combinations, the first ones that come to mind for me are the best possible equity hands that can make some good hands to improve later. So it's possible to raise, for example, a weak flush draw or a hand like 4-5. And then it's also possible to raise a hand that has some decent backdoor equity, like the Queen Jack with the Queen of Hearts. And so a hand like Queen Jack off, diamonds and clubs, doesn't have the heart backdoor and also not the blocker, which is an important thing, right? So if we have a heart in our hand, then our opponent is less likely to have a heart. So in theory, it's a slightly less good bluff than Queen Jack with the Queen of Hearts, for example, is. But now in this specific spot, I believe that Alex, this is a board that I would be c-betting 100% of the time, and I think he does so too. So that is the first thing. So I also think he opens slightly wider than the normal hijack, which is also something I would do. So we are facing a wider range that auto c-bets this flop, or at least I think he will be c-betting maybe different sizes. I think his main size will be between 25 and 35%, probably between 30 and 33%, so a third pop bet. And he might have some larger bets on this flop as well, given the ICM situation. So there is some, I think it's reasonable to be betting like pocket jacks or ace 10 and some bluffs. I think are very reasonable to go with larger sizes, like having King 5 suited, I think is a really, let's say of diamonds, I think is a pretty decent hand to be betting larger on this flop. So majority, to break it down, he opens a bit wider. I think he auto c-bets the flop, and I think that the majority of his bets, like 80-90% of the time, will be a third pot. Now it's about, okay, how does he continue against a raise? And a lot of it will be calling, and in theory, there should always be some raises as well. And that is something where now kind of the exploitative side comes into play. I think that especially in spots where people perceive someone to be more polarized or quite polarized, where, okay, he has a strong hand or a weaker hand, they don't really, they kind of remove these mediocre hands. So they remove any type of jams or most of the jams and only jam their really strong hands. So if he has like a Queen 10, he won't really play for stacks, he will just call. And that's generally a good thing for us. And so also with bluffs, yeah. So it just probably won't be going crazy, as I most likely have an air hand with some equity or a good 10 or deuces or threes. So what happens in the hand is he goes for that third pot c-bet that I was talking about. So he bets 1.8 big blinds into 5.5. And now I have a hand that I think in theory is basically almost always a fold. with maybe a very tiny frequency of raises, but I think in this payout scenario, it's probably 0%. I decide to go for an exploitative play and check raise his hand. And there is a variety of reasons. I think he's folding a bit too much on the flop. And as you can see, I'm debating between folding and raising, which I think both are pretty reasonable options. So I think in this spot, I would like to go a bit wider than I should be going in theory. And I think Queen Jack off is a pretty decent candidate for that. Obviously, I would prefer a heart because I think he under defends a little bit on the flop, but mostly how it continues on turns and rivers. Because in a lot of these runouts, actually, he's supposed to jam over turn bets, for example. And I think that, like to a certain degree, and I think that I will have a lot of profitable small bets on the turn. So that is a big reason how I built this hand, because I think he's not going to want to call down thinly here. So quite a lot of his continuing hands on the flop, I think he's not going to go with all the way in the frequency that he's supposed to. And that is now where I think, for example, on a card like the 10 of spades, I think that there's two reasons now why I think this is a very clear continue. And the hands I want to attack are his ace highs and also like his king queen and his king jack and to a degree also hands that already struggle, where he will probably continue, but he's not loving it, which is like pocket fours or pocket fives. Those hands he shouldn't be folding, but also he's not loving it. So I think it's much more in a tendency where he might make some tight folds rather than being too loose here. So in spots like that where I only need to risk like 7 to 8 big blinds, which I think is the best sizing to go for here, given the polarized nature of the spot, he obviously has some flush draws, but I still think that with the bluffs I have and with the value hands I have, I think it's slightly better to bet a smaller sizing here. So my preferred sizing here is between like 30 and 40% of the pot, maybe like a 7 to 8 big blinds bet. Let's see what I'm doing. And I think the queen of diamonds, jack of clubs now is actually a pretty reasonable hand, as I'm blocking some of his queen 10s and jack 10s, especially the suited ones. Obviously, again, I'm not blocking his flush draws, but I really like this bet here, and I think it will lead to a bit of overfolding, and I also think that he's not pushing me enough of my equity. Yeah, so a lot of his hand, like for example, I think that in theory he should be jamming hands like king queen or queen jack off here, which is pretty wild, but I don't think he will have these wild jams on the turn at all. I think he will jam for value, and I think he will jam some flush draws. So wrapping up this hand, I went a pip wider in terms of hands that I should be raising, and I think especially finding these type of spots where now Alex is a really strong opponent. I think he's a fantastic player, but especially on lower stakes, people will fold the flop way too much, they will fold the turn way too much, and especially in those spots, I think this is a really great risk-reward ratio for a hand like queen jack off, where you also have some equity to hit a jack or a queen or a 9 or a king and improve on later streets. So yeah, I really like this hand. I think this was an interesting insight into how I deconstruct and try to look for exploits on high stakes and then buy-ins like the 10K. And yeah, that was an insight into how I think about poker, and I think a pretty fun bluff out of the 10K. So if you guys enjoy content like this, I'd really appreciate if you subscribe to the channel. That motivates me to put out more content and put on the notifications so you don't miss any of our new content. And I'll see you soon.